答えは常に塔の上にある。
Webtoons, the source of much hype this anime season. Just as One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach once dominated the manga sphere as the big three, Webtoons have their own big three: Tower of God, God of High School, and Noblesse. And as luck would have it, all three announced new animes in 2020 to great fanfare. Many YouTubers called this the greatest update in anime, but the three eventually opened to less stellar results. Tower of God, the most hyped of the three, did okay, rating at 7.75 on MyAnimeList, despite some comments about it being rushed. God of High School was not as lucky, doing worse with its poor pacing and lack of character. But by far, the most disappointing of the three has to be Noblesse, getting a rating of just 6.6. As a huge fan of the original webtoon, who has waited years for an anime to finally bring the series to the mainstream, this was extremely disappointing to me. Noblesse was the first webtoon I ever read. Back then, I read it on Manga Reader, and my tiny little brain couldn't figure out that I had to scroll down to read a webtoon, and so I kept clicking next to another chapter after only reading the first panel and thought, this doesn't make sense. But eventually I found the scroll button and had my mind blown by Noblesse. For those unaware, Noblesse is the story of Raizo, a noble, immortal beings loosely based on vampires, who woke up from a 820-year slumber and enrolled in a Korean high school. The synopsis does not do it much justice, but know that the webtoon is extremely hilarious and badass at the same time. I was thrilled when the anime was announced. Finally, I can share my love for sparkly, good-looking vampires and not get confused with a Twilight fan. But my expectations came crashing down when I watched the long-awaited anime and realized what an absolute wreck it was. So yeah, this video is just a way for me to curb my disappointment. To understand how this all went wrong, we need to go back to 2016, back when the world was not in a pandemic and Trump was still a reality TV star.
You're fired.
In 2016, Noblesse released a single 30-minute OVA. The problem was, the decision was made to cram the entire season 1 of the webtoon, over 90 chapters, into a single episode. Not a mini-series, just one 30-minute episode. Typically, a single anime episode adapts about 3 manga chapters. In Tower of God, which was considered rushed by many, the anime adapted 20 chapters per episode. 90 chapters in 30 minutes is ridiculous. Of the 30 minutes, the last 15 minutes focuses on the final fight in the webtoon. This means that 90 chapters of character development, backstories, interactions, relationships and growth was condensed into just the first 15 minutes. I don't need to explain why this is a bad idea, but some might say, hey, the first season of Noblesse in the webtoon barely had any fight scenes. We spend most of our time watching Rai do stupid things like go to school, play video games. What's wrong with skipping all the insignificant school stuff and go straight to the badass fighting that everyone is here for? This is where I need to explain something about Noblesse. Unlike Tower of God and God of High School, which are pure action and battle series, Noblesse is very much a comedic series that also does action, at least at the beginning. The series spends most of its time depicting the absurdity of a 10,000-year-old deity who just woke up after going to sleep in the Middle Ages, and is going through daily experiences like discovering ramen, learning how to open a door, or him getting destroyed at video games. And this is important because Noblesse thrives in its comedy and badassery, and the two partner each other. As some smart person who I only know about because I watched a wisecrack video said, comedy is incongruity, meaning that when something is supposed to happen but doesn't, our expectations are thrown off and it's funny. So, when an immortal vampire who has lived for thousands of years can't use a doorknob, it's funny. On the flip side, something is badass when expectations are surpassed. So when Rai or Frankenstein, who goof around the entire series, suddenly gets serious and destroys their opponent, it's super badass. The funnier the characters, the more badass they seem when they turn serious. And the more badass the characters, the funnier they are when they goof around, creating this wheel that supercharges the entire series. One Punch Man works in a similar way. if One Punch Man had luscious locks and adoring fangirls. The Noblesse webtoon threads this line between the two well, making for extremely entertaining situations. The OVA, however, completely removes all these small comedic moments, leaving behind the more flashy parts like the final fight scene. But without the proper build-up, the final fight scene of the episode, although aesthetically pleasing, is so boring. Needless to say, I'm not a fan of the 2016 adaptation. But that was fine. Maybe it was a pilot to see if people were interested in Noblesse. Maybe in the future, they would do it right. Now, 4 years later, in present day, the Noblesse anime was announced. I got excited. Finally, they can reboot the series and give Noblesse its due. Nope, they decided to keep the OVA as canon and start the anime from season 2. So now, the season starts with characters and relationships who behave like they have gone through an entire season's worth of development. Because in the webtoon, they did. But for the average anime viewer, this is essentially episode 2, and nothing makes sense. So now that we know that character development and plot have been completely left to rot, let's look at other ways the anime has decided to screw over the webtoon. As I mentioned earlier, comedy is essential for Noblesse. It is what made it so popular in the first place. Unlike the OVA, the Noblesse anime tries to incorporate some comedic scenes. But the comedy of Noblesse is contextual, building on established relationships and norms and subverting them to make it funny. The most essential dynamic is between Rai, Frankenstein, and the students. Rai is an all-powerful noble and master of Frankenstein, living as a high school student. Frankenstein is the strongest human, serving Rai and is the principal of Yeran High School. Shinwoo and gang are the students of Yeran High and have accepted Rai into their friend group. There is a triangle of power, and this can be abused for comedic effect. When the human students mess up Frankenstein's home while visiting Rai, Frankenstein gets annoyed. But when he looks at Rai, Rai ignores it, and Frankenstein is left unable to do anything. Trust me, this is funny when it's not being explained by some random dude on YouTube. Many other jokes leverage on this relationship between the three parties, and I found all of them hilarious. But in the anime, without the proper setup and development of the relationship, it doesn't hit the same way. With many of the jokes falling flat, the series just seems slow and boring. Pacing. Unlike the OVA, this season tries to slow things down and incorporate more scenes from the webtoon, which is definitely the right step. However, it has somehow managed to flip to the opposite spectrum of being draggy and slow, while still missing key elements from the series. Instead of restructuring the material to fit the pace of the anime, they simply adapt chunks from the webtoon and leave out equally important material. Take this scene where Tao, an agent of the villainous union, meets Ikan, one of the human students, for the first time. The two had been impressed with each other's hacking abilities and arranged to meet up in person. In the webtoon, the meeting is to the point with a few panels. We establish the bond between Tao and Ikan as like-minded souls. But just as they were starting to get comfortable, Tao suddenly notices something and leaves. He was being tracked by another member of the union, Shark, who now threatens to kill Ikan for compromising Tao. Tao deflects, saying he doesn't care, but he is obviously disturbed by the thought. This scene is important for a few reasons. First, it increases the tension with Ikan's life now at risk. Next, it highlights the dysfunctional dynamics of the union and the chaotic nature of some members. And finally, it humanizes Tao, showing that he is not an unfeeling monster like some of the others in the union. However, when adapting this scene, the anime chooses to adapt the conversation between Tao and Ikan word for word, while leaving out the second interaction between Tao and Shark entirely. This leads to a slow and draggy conversation that works much better on the webtoon than in an animation, and forgoes the tension and development that would have made the scene so much more exciting. These weird choices of what to adapt plagues the entire series, making it a bland and uninspired adaptation. To summarize, The Noblesse anime adaptation was sloppy, boring, and a waste of an amazing series. Choosing not to reboot the OVA was bad enough, but the lack of understanding for what made the webtoon work truly put the nail in the coffin. Don't bother with the anime. If you're interested, read the webtoon. Peace. It's so sad. Noblesse shouldn't be so bad. How could this be? How can this happen to dear Frankenstein? But watching right fall so low, all of my hopes suddenly goes away somehow. This anime is so bad. I have died every day waiting for you. I'm a fan for so long. I have loved you for 1,000 years. But now all is lost for 1,000 more.